Hey, welcome to Accidental Gods, to the podcast where we believe that another world is still possible, and that together we can make it happen. I'm Amanda Scott, and I spent the first series of this podcast laying out the basic toolkit that we think is essential to making conscious evolution a possibility, which is the entire premise behind the whole Accidental Gods project. This podcast, the website, and the membership program that lies behind it. We spent the second and now the third series striving to find that extraordinary generative intersection between art and activism, politics and philosophy, science and spirituality, from which we can craft a vision of a future that is generative for all of us, for the human and the more than human worlds. And my guest this week lives at that intersection. Adam Hamdy's first degree was in law from Oxford. His second was in philosophy from London. Now he's a screenwriter who works with teams on both sides of the Atlantic and a best-selling novelist. He's been a management consultant, and as he'll tell us, he's on the board of Ligandal, a company striving to find an actual science-based treatment and prophylaxis for the coronavirus. Adam is an all-round polymath, and he's also one of the best informed and grounded people I know. When I'm not clear where the sense-making lies in the torrent of misinformation that we are fed by our political overseers, Adam is my go-to for common and uncommon sense. As you'll hear, he is one of those people who goes to find out what the data actually are and how we can implement them in a way that is best for us all. So, people of the podcast, please welcome Adam Hamdy. So, Adam Hamdy, one of the most extraordinary polymaths I have ever come across, and we will have listed in the intro all of the very many things that you do very, very well. But I do want to congratulate you on Black 13 being recommended amongst the crime novels of the year by Barry Forshaw. I will put the link in the show notes because there is no higher accolade. Barry is the king of crime reviewers. So very well done. And welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Amanda. And I want to thank you for inviting me to be part of this. What you're doing with Accidental Gods is absolutely fascinating, bringing together a wonderful collection of people to give insight and advice on how to improve life and improve our journey through the world for so many people. So this is really an honor to be part of it.
Thank you. We are equally honored to have you here. So in our chat beforehand, we were discussing what is most alive for you in this moment. And you said that it was empowering people. And I thought that sounded an extraordinarily wonderful place to leap off from. So can you tell us what you mean by empowering people and how we might go about it?
Absolutely. I think, it's very clear that we're living through difficult and fearful times. People are very worried and concerned about the way the world's heading for a variety of different reasons. And the most pressing of this is obviously the COVID-19 pandemic. But fear and worry, anxiety shrinks people's worlds. I believe that it's something I've said to my children for a very long time. My daughter used to be very anxious about going to friends' birthday parties. And I said, if you allow that anxiety to take hold, you will have a much smaller experience of life. You will stop going to parties. You will have fewer friends. You will stop having those experiences. And that's the nature of fear. It stops you, it prevents you from doing things that you might otherwise do, things that might enrich your life. And it's something that I've seen throughout my life with people that I've worked with. Before I became an author, I was a management consultant, and I've worked with chief executives of huge organizations. And they're people who are ostensibly on the surface very confident, very capable, but actually when you get to know them and when you understand their issues, they're gripped by fear. And so I think, one of the things that we often struggle with in life is that we live the language of fear. Everything that we experience from, when we're children growing up, teachers, parents, people around us can reinforce this idea that we're not capable, we can't do things, we have failed, we have not
Yes.
achieved whatever we've set out to do. And actually, what we're not taught is that failure is part of the journey towards success. And you'll know as a creative that failure is an essential part of what you do.
Oh, yes. 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 As a novelist, if
Yeah.
you don't get stuck down many rabbit holes and crash and burn, then you're not really finding your best work, I think.
Absolutely, and I think you're completely right. And as a creative, part of the journey, I think, of becoming an effective creative is knowing that you're going to experience failure, that you're going to experience moments where everything seems to be going wrong. And if I think one of the things that we can do as human beings is actually embrace failure and learn that it is just a step on the road to success. When you have a disaster, it could be something as simple as making a cake. You've learned something from that you can take out of it and improve the next time. I've obviously, with lockdown, got into home baking, and I was having a
Oh, have you?
yeah.
Are you making sourdough?
No, not sourdough. No, I'm making
Okay.
bagels. Proper Italian pizza dough, bread.
Wow.
And I was a bit hit and miss with the proving process. And I spoke to a friend of mine who is an authentic French baker who does specialize in sourdoughs and baguettes. And he said to me, "Oh, just touch the water that you're using to mix with the yeast, and if it feels slightly cold to you, you've got it at the right temperature. If it feels body temperature or warmer, it's going to kill the yeast."
Oh,
And,
interesting.
and so, my failures actually helped me get to a point now where I can make a good bagel.
Yes, that is impressive.
Life, taking that from that very sort of comical example, that applies to everything that we do in life. And I think that we need to get out of this habit of talking about people as having failed. And we do it, and it's particularly noticeable in the press. Often the tabloids will relish over someone's failure. And, once someone's been labeled as a failure, life becomes very difficult for them.
Well, unless you're Prime Minister, when it doesn't seem to touch you at all. But yeah. Sorry. I did say I wasn't going to be political. I failed already. We're 5 minutes in. Could we take a step back? Because I know you've done a lot of research into neuroscience and human behavior, and you've got a non-fiction book coming out looking at that. One of the things that really interests me, because I believe that in indigenous cultures, when I was writing the Boudica books, I really looked into indigenous cultures. And I came across a lot of old anthropological stuff, particularly with the first peoples of the North Americas. And one particular paper where a priest was feeling very proud of himself because he had taught the natives to beat their children, which previously was anathema to them. And you can just trace the whole kind of catastrophe of us moving away from being in context with the earth and moving away from a generative lifestyle where children were brought up believing that they were the best that they could be into a world where we were brought up believing that we were inherently broken and damaged and guaranteed to fail. And so I'm thinking that parents and teachers teach this to the kids because they believe it to be true, because it's what they were taught, and we could go back many hundreds of generations before we find the break where that happened. But have you any insight? Is there any neurological benefit to teaching people that they are inherently failures? Because my feeling is humanity doesn't create behaviors that have no benefit. That's not, I think, possibly an evolutionary useful thing to do. There must at some point have been a benefit to this internal belief. Have you found one?
I think the opposite is true. I think that when you try and beat people out of failure, create more failure.
Yes, of course. Yes. I wasn't suggesting otherwise.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, no. So I'm saying I think that, all of these behaviors that we see parents and teachers and the people who form us exhibiting are very harmful. And there are a number of reasons for this. The first is that, when you look at neurological studies that have been done on fear and anxiety, it always yield suboptimal results in terms of decision making. And we know that. We don't need studies to tell us that. We know that from personal experience. If you're afraid, you make bad decisions. You can't think clearly. Your anxiety kind of takes hold. And so what you're doing by, beating or chastising children or just trying to shout them out of failure is you're creating anxiety around failure. They become fearful of failure.
Yes.
And it's actually so common that you find people not willing to take the risk because they are afraid that they're going to fail. It's one of the biggest, if you're working with executives in big businesses, it's one of their big worries is their fear of failure.
And presumably this is what leads to the imposter syndrome that we hear so much about, of people who've got to be extremely good at what they do, but still are afraid that it's at some point somebody is going to find out the secret,
right,
which is that they're not very good at it.
Yeah. But actually there's no such thing as an imposter, because the higher up you go and the more sophisticated in terms of technical expertise people are, you realize that actually everyone's winging it to a certain extent. You're just pushing the boundaries more if you know more about your subject. So you're always going to feel for the edges of your life. So I've worked with, very, very, very cutting edge scientists who probably know more about virology and immunology than, many leading experts. But they still suffer from, similar inadequacies and similar fear of failure. And the other one, obviously, is the fear of success. So, for the simple reason that you're going to make people anxious around failure and therefore make them more likely to fail and also less likely to take risk, that's not a good way to raise children. But the other issue is, if you try and discourage people from failure, you end up with a society where you get very little growth. Because we grow through taking risks, we grow through trying new things, we grow through experimentation, and this is personal growth and growth in society and in business. So you don't grow by not taking any risks. And what you're encouraging people to do, you can't say to someone, don't fail. You can't beat someone into not failing. You have to teach them what they can learn from that failure and what they can take from that, and how they can do something different to improve or get a better result next time. That's, that's what we should be encouraging. That's how we will nurture children and, and adults into delivering the best for themselves and for society.
And also, I have to say, the animals that we work with, I spend a lot of time training dogs and horses, and we have discovered in agility competition, where the difference between getting a gold and getting nothing can be hundredths of a second, that if you don't train with positive reinforcement, you are not going to get anywhere close, because the dogs need to feel that they are free from consequences of failure, that it's okay to experiment, that it's okay to go completely all out for everything, because it's going, you will not be told that you did it wrong. And what we're discovering with horses is that if you can produce that same mindset, you have a very, very different way of relating. Anyway, that's off on a different track.
No, I mean, that's fascinating to learn. And I think that, you don't need, I believe that you don't actually need to reinforce the fact that someone has failed. You feel it within yourself. And actually that kind of darkness that people feel, that sense of failure that people feel, is a motivator. If left alone, people will try and improve on their own performance. But if you reinforce that failure, if you tell them they must not fail, you're creating all the conditions for them not to try again.
Yeah, and I think also, I know from my own writing that if I were to label something as failure, just the fact that I had labeled it that would be crushing. I don't know about you, but writing always feels to me as if you're walking along a high wire over the Niagara Falls juggling flaming chainsaws, and it's quite terrifying enough without me hammering myself for failure. So I have to label the 6 weeks going down a rabbit hole that really wasn't ideal as experimentation and
Right.
as exploring other avenues. And then I come back and go, well, that was exciting and interesting and fascinating. And it's taught me I've got this new bit of exciting, because you always generate something in it not being where the book needs to go. There's a reason why it wasn't, and the reason then opens doors to where the book does need to go. And in the labeling it as something that feels to me generative rather than something that feels to me destructive, then I have the inner capacity to do that again, because every time, this may just be me and my stuff, but writing a book feels like climbing Everest. And if I felt that I had just fallen down a crevasse, I might just decide to give up and go and stock shelves in Sainsbury's, which would both pay better and be less stressful. So I think the labeling of it is quite important too. So are you finding with your children or with the adults that you work with that we can learn to not be hemmed in by fear?
Absolutely. I mean, I sit on the advisory board of a genetic medicine company called Ligandal at the moment, and I'm working a lot with the chief executive there. And I think I've worked with chief executives, a lot in the past, and people throughout different organizations. And actually, the message that I have for people is to be kind to themselves. We're taught growing up that the world is a certain way and that you have to conform and fit in with the system, and that you need to get the house and the car and the 2 kids and the wife and and this is what your life should look like.
Yeah.
But actually, there is no, if you're just thinking about the world in its free-form native state, there is none of this. There is none of this. We've made this. We've created the systems, and we've created the order based on actually some kind of heritage that's been handed down, through the generations that we may or may not like many components of. And so once you accept that there are no rules and that life is a journey, I think it changes your perspective, and it comes very much back to what you were saying about, your perspective in your work and climbing the mountain. That what you perceive as a failure, as a setback, is actually just another step on the journey. And so the one thing that I talk to when I talk to my own children, when I talk to people that I work with, I just say, be kind to yourself. Actually, don't be so hard on yourself. And that applies across every area of life. We can be quick to judge others, but we're even quicker to judge ourselves.
Yes.
And we're so, quite often people will be so hard on themselves and not cut themselves any slack. And they focus on all the negatives. And again, you'll probably know as an author that you could have 100 really great reviews, but the one that sticks in your mind.
Yep. And that's the one where you think, oh God, they got it. Everybody else who writes good stuff, you think, well, I'm not sure you actually read it properly. But that's very kind of you. And then somebody goes, this is the biggest heap of shit the world's ever seen. And you go, oh God, you saw it. You're right. And I'll never write again. Yeah. I think I have a very fragile ego. But
no, you don't. You have a very normal ego. Yeah. We tend to discount the positive and focus on the negative. And that's true in life as a whole, not just for creatives. You will be really hard on yourself for what you perceive as your failings. But what's interesting is that people will often manifest that in behaviors towards others.
Yes.
So you'll be at your most tetchy and aggressive and hostile when you feel that you failed the most.
Yes, because you're projecting, you have to project it out, because otherwise the internal structures that I've created will crumble. What I'm finding with Accidental Gods, because we're spending quite a lot of time, I did a 10-hour workshop 3 weeks ago, working on exactly this. We invited people to look at what is your default feeling. So in the quiet moments, or when you start work, or when you're just mulling stuff over, what is the feeling underlying that? And for almost everybody, it's one of self-judgment, responsibility, fear, all of the things that come around life being hard. And then, so what if you were able to choose? What would you choose? And then how can we change that default so that your default feeling is something else. And in order to teach that, I've had to practice it. And I started at the beginning of lockdown. So we're talking, 18 weeks now? And I am finding it's extraordinary, and it's a very interesting path to walk on. But changing that default is a daily work, and I enjoy the work. I now really look forward to meditating, and I'm in that sort of faith. I'm going to go and meditate now. It's great. Rather than, meditation is something that I do because I really think that I should. But it's taking, I was not expecting it to take as long, or for the layers and layers of my own ability to go, yes, but, to be so many. Do you find this with other people, or have you got a technique for changing that default feeling to something generative overnight? And please, if you have, would you share it?
Yeah, I mean, okay, so there are lots of different pathways to get to this point, and some of it is quite scientific, some of it's quite philosophical, some of it's quite spiritual, but actually your end result is that you want to do exactly what you said, change your default setting, if you like. And the thing that works for me actually is just nothingness, emptiness. It's I don't wake up with a particular feeling any day. I don't wake up depressed. I don't wake up, happy. I don't wake up. I just wake up content, if you like. It's that feeling of emptiness.
Well, contentment isn't empty, really, is it? Contentment is a generative sense, I would suspect.
I would say the contentment would evolve and come through the day. I wake up with nothing, and I think one of the ways that that's happened to me personally is through a lot of adversity. Actually, I've gone the painful route. So rather than actively seeking out spiritual understanding or scientific understanding, I've kind of lived through a lot of different struggles and figured out through trial and error that actually most things you encounter in life you can get through. Most problems that you are confronted with you can resolve, and that it's not really worth being too judgmental of yourself or others, and that it's not worth worrying about the things that you can't control, and the things you can control you can fix. And so it's been a difficult journey to get to this point, but I'm glad that it happened, because it's enabled me to kind of deal with quite stressful situations that other people find, stressful and challenging, but just look at them quite calmly and say, oh, actually, this is what we need to do to resolve it. And it's a useful state of mind to be in. But in terms of other people reaching that state sort of consciously, I wouldn't recommend the painful route. That's not
one of my early teachers said we will learn through pain until we learn how to learn through love. And if you choose to learn through pain, then know that it's a choice. So yes.
Right. Yeah, I wouldn't advise learning through pain. So I think there are meditative techniques that people can engage with, and it's kind of about giving yourself time to reflect and to understand and to grow. But there are also scientific techniques that people can read up on to understand how their minds function and to understand themselves better. And different people respond to different techniques. So some people will want that sort of spiritual growth, and other people like to ground their development in fact and knowledge and understanding. So I had an instance recently where I was talking to a friend who has fallen for a girl who's not interested in him, or certainly
we all do that.
Right. So is certainly expressing that she's not interested. I don't know whether she really is interested or not. But I then took him through the neuroscientific manifestations of attraction and why it's happening and how it's affecting his brain. And
can you do that for us, Adam? Because this podcast really enjoys neuroscience geekery. So give us some geekery.
Okay.
That would be really good.
Yeah, okay. So when you meet someone for the first time, your brain does a really quick calculation. And it uses the olfactory receptors to assess the pheromones given off. And I always thought pheromones were something that people, tried to manufacture to attract, the opposite sex. But as in they were sold in bottles by snake oil salesmen on a.
No,
But
no, no,
actually,
no. I think they're real.
it's a real thing. Yeah, no, it is. It's a
Horses
real
have
thing.
them, so they're
Yeah.
not buying stuff.
Yeah, but they're not. They're not for swindlers. It's a real thing. So what happens is your brain makes a quick calculation, and it seems to look for the optimal immunological benefit that will be conferred by your reproduction. And by optimal, your immune profile can't be too far away or too close to your parents. In your partner, in your potential partner, and it makes this quick calculation, and you're also using your visual senses to. Your brain is also assessing visually whether this person is an optimal mate. And at the point when it decides, and it's all happening really quickly, at the point when it decides that this is an optimal mate, your brain is flooded with hormones and chemicals, and your frontal cortex is shut down, and you lose the ability. Yeah.
Oh, whoops.
There's been a lot of research into the science of love, and it's absolutely fascinating. And what happens is you lose the ability to critically reason around this particular individual, and it's specific, it's time specific, and specific to this person. So you'll have judgment about everything else in your life, but around this one person, your brain literally shuts down your sort of critical reasoning and your logical functions, which is why you can have so many people saying, well, I don't understand what she sees in him, or he sees in her, or she sees in her. You can have people who are completely blinded to the flaws. And if you think about it, there's an evolutionary reason for that. If you can see the flaws in someone, you are less likely to mate.
Right. And this person has been judged optimal by the parts of you that are good at judging those things.
Right,
so it
exactly.
matters that your head isn't going, no, he doesn't have a good enough job.
Exactly. So you're so then you wake up in 6 months' time when all of those things have worn away, and you go, how did I end? What did I see in that person?
And now how do I extract myself from this?
But
so how long does it last, this frontal cortex shutdown? Just for those who are in this state and want to.
I mean, there's some debate about this. There's a theory that we go through an attraction stage, which is this stage, and then there's an attachment stage where you get a different release of hormones that sort of build towards long-term empathy,
more
and
serotonin
understanding.
And less oxytocin.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and then so there's some debate over how long this attraction phase lasts, but it's months to a year.
But it also must be there's everybody knows that there's the totally attracted, get together, wake up in the morning and think, oh my God, and leave. So there must also be, okay, we mated and now we don't need to know each other anymore. I kind of, if you don't get to through the attraction to the attachment, you go straight from attraction to revulsion. Because, as far as presumably the biology is concerned,
you've done your job.
You've done what you needed to do. So
I think there's probably some mathematics in there as well, like optimization, number of times, and cycles and all that sort of thing, which I don't really want to get into. But the interesting thing about it is that that mothers experience the same thing with their babies. So the
frontal shutdown.
The frontal shutdown is something. So it's baby specific.
Yeah.
So. That idea of everyone having the most beautiful baby in the world is very true, because to everyone they do.
And so many of my friends who just are bewailing the fact that they feel they gave birth to their brain and now they can't think for the first however many months is presumably because the frontal shutdown has happened.
Partly, and also...
really interested to know if this happens. So in tribal societies, again, with Boudica, I was looking at this, where there is no sense of ownership by fathers. So mating happens, the children are born, the tribe rears them, and it doesn't matter who they were sired by. I wonder, and therefore the attachment phase is attachment within a tribe. You don't end up with this bizarre one-on-one, domesticity that the Romans brought in, the kind of monogamy and 2.5 kids and a golden retriever. Not that the golden retriever was Roman, obviously. It's a whole different dynamic. And I can feel studies arising in my head that probably will never get done because there aren't enough really indigenous tribes surviving in ways that we would need to be able to work with. I wonder why it changed. Because monogamy is crazy on almost every level, except when you have ownership of land that needs to pass down some kind of patrilineal descent line, which was part of our removing ourselves from context with the earth. I'm not expecting you to answer this. I'm just thinking out loud that the neuroscience must have changed at some point.
I mean, you do see attachment forming in the brain in fathers. I mean, that is something that you can measure. You can see an increase in activity in the empathy centers.
And increases in oxytocin. For sure.
Oxytocin, yeah, you can see all of that. So, but I think you're absolutely right. This is complete speculation, but I think it's to do with property. The idea of the importance of setting yourself apart from the community, that the child is property because it's going to own your property and pass to you. That rather your property is going to pass to them. I think that's the point at which we lost this community sense.
Although Mickey Kashtan, the non-violent communicator I spoke to a few weeks ago, and I think off air said that when men are in the presence of young children, their testosterone drops, their oxytocin and progesterone, I think, rises. And in a tribal setting, they would always be there would always be young children. And so that hormonal effect would be happening perpetually, whether they were specifically biologically your children or not, as that adult male whose job is guardianship, you would have guardianship of the whole tribe and of all the young people. So therefore that would then be integrated in that. And at some point, exactly as you say, we've shifted that more towards this is my child and therefore it can inherit what I own.
Well, I mean, I think that's really interesting. And I think it comes down to, where we set responsibility in society and what are we responsible for. And that's something that I've been thinking about recently, particularly with regards to with the pandemic, and how far can we go to help make things better? I don't know what your thoughts are in terms of, what is our obligation as people to help during this quite challenging time.
Say a little bit more about that, because this is something that Mickey and I talked about and I've thought about a lot in the intervening month. So can you phrase that question differently? Because I'm not sure what context we're in.
Well, I mean, I think that right now people are feeling quite scared and, fearful, as we talked about before. And, often I'm hearing people express helplessness. What can I do? How can I make this situation better?
Okay, so how far can we all go to help each other feel agency?
Yeah, agency. What can we do to help improve this situation that we all find ourselves in?
Yeah. Yes, which is actually the whole basis of Accidental Gods, is giving people agency. And of Humanity Rising. Are you familiar with that? Did we talk about that?
Yeah, we did, yeah.
Because it seems to me that part of, if it is the case that the old structure is crumbling around us, which it certainly feels to me that it is, that there's ever more frantic kind of clinging on by those whose imaginations have been hampered. I spoke early on to Rob Hopkins, who was founder of the Transition Town movement, and then has written an amazing book called From What Is to What If. And we recorded an entire podcast and the sound didn't work, so it never went out. But as part of it, he was saying that the public school system is a disimagination machine. It's designed exactly to make people feel as if they have to fend off an inner inadequacy. And we can see that in those who are, I would suggest, currently running the country, and in the greater mass of those who are propping up what we might loosely call neoliberal capitalism. Trump apparently said this morning he was going to shut down TikTok in America. And it's that sort of whatever you have to do to hold on to the structure that exists, because it is impossible internally to imagine that structure not existing, and a very fearful thing. So part of what those of us who feel the world would be better without that structure need to do is to help it not be frightening. That it to help people to be able to imagine how the world might be without that structure. And part of doing that, it seems to me, is that we create a sense of agency and create the vision of exactly how a world could be differently, because we exist at the moment where it is genuinely and literally easier to imagine near-term human extinction than it is to imagine a world without the current structure. And that doesn't seem to me either necessary or useful. And so for me, the first thing is giving people the capacity to imagine how it would feel if the world were different. Because my understanding of neuroscience is if we can build a felt template, the non-fear template, the template of a world that is generative and that feels good, whatever good is for the individual, then we can build the structures that get us to that. And I think Humanity Rising and a number of other endeavors around that are really working very hard to create imaginal structures of how the world could be, to give people the agency to go there. Does that answer the question that you asked?
Yes, it does. And I don't mean to be asking you questions on your
That's
podcast, but
this the whole podcast is a conversation. This is helping people. This is the point of the podcast, is to create those imaginal spaces. So let's riff on that.
Yeah, no, I think that's I think it's really important. I think one of the things that struck me, I mean, I used to consult in the medical industry. My wife's been writing about pandemics for 15 years.
Wow.
I saw what was happening, and it was my imagination that allowed me to project forward and see what that meant.
Right.
And early in, it was the middle of February, I got asked by a former cabinet minister to write a report for Matt Hancock on what I thought this pandemic was going. Well, first of all, did I think there was going to be a pandemic, and what I thought it would involve.
Right.
And that was sent to him. That was sent to Hancock on the 2nd of March, and I had sent it to a number of scientists around the world for review before I sent it to my cabinet minister contact, and so I sent it to Professor Sir David King, who's obviously now running Independent Sage, and he wrote back and said, "This is a fabulous piece of work. It needs to be published in a national newspaper and discussed widely." And because what I'd done was I'd said, there's a pandemic coming. This is a serious virus, and we need to lock down preventatively as a precaution for 4 weeks, tool up a test and trace system, put testing in at airports, quarantine everything, and then reopen. Once we have all the controls in place that we need to make sure that we can track the virus, we can reopen more or less as normal, which is essentially what New Zealand did.
Right.
Some of the scientists that I sent it to, and I'm not going to name any names because it's quite embarrassing what they said. One in particular wrote back to me and said, "I wholeheartedly disagree with you. This is no more serious than flu. What you're proposing would involve the shutdown of the 50% of the economy for 4 weeks. It would cause terrible damage." This
is a scientist, not an economist.
This was an extremely prominent medical scientist.
Oh dear.
Yes, who has since put his name to a letter saying that everything should be shut down until the virus is eradicated.
Oh no.
Yes. So I actually emailed him, and I didn't rub it in, but I said, "What has caused you to change your position?"
It's called, in this house, it's called doing the schnorr dance, and the schnorr dance is quite fun, actually.
But what struck me was that I was seeing what was going to unfold, and pretty much, and you can read a summary of the research. It's available for my sins on Free Market Conservatives, because
Yes.
one of
Wasn't it
my
Conservative Home?
no, it's
Okay, we'll put the
freemarketconservatives.com.
link in the show notes if you can send me
One
the
of
link
my
again.
one of my friends is editor of the site, and I wanted to reach the people who influence decision making in the government. It doesn't reflect my politics, but it was it seemed to me a good place to try and influence decision makers. But what happened was I got abuse from people around the Conservative Party, and my recommendations were obviously ignored, and it was all because people couldn't imagine. They
Yeah.
couldn't put themselves slightly into the future and picture what might be and how one could make changes now to prevent that or to make things better. And I think you're absolutely right. I think the old structures are failing, and we're seeing them laid bare. We can see the failures, and we're counting them in unfortunately, in mortality.
Yes.
And what concerns me is that all the emphasis from those in power is to get things back the way they were.
Yep. Yes. Because I think partly there's a tendency, I speak as someone quite a long way along the Asperger scale, which I think I share probably with certain of those in power, particularly Cummings. And there's a tendency one has imagination and one has planned out one's actions for the next, several months, sort of playing the internal multidimensional chess and seeing the moves that we're going to make. And it takes quite a lot of internal flexibility to let go of that. And I think what I imagine in the people currently in power is that they had their grids all laid out. They had everything planned. They had the things that were their priorities. And it's proved extremely difficult for them to come off that track and go into something that's more unknown, therefore more challenging, and that requires different levels of thinking. Does that fit with what you understand?
I think you're absolutely right. I think, and it's something that I struggle with because I'm very adaptive. I can see when a change needs to be made and
Pivot.
pivot.
Yeah.
Because that's, and I think coming back to your public school thing, I went to a very below average state school, and I think growing up, we didn't have much when I was growing up as a family. I think it teaches you that you have to work hard and you have to be adaptive. You have to be ingenious. You have to try and find opportunity, and when you find it, you have to try and seize it.
Yeah.
And that's not something that you're taught at public school, particularly if you come from the backgrounds that a lot of these people have come from, which is one of privilege and wealth, where
And
you
entitlement. Yeah.
And so it doesn't teach you to be creative necessarily in your thinking. It teaches you how to sustain systems, you might try and optimize systems, but you're not trying to radically change them.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think and even now you're seeing it. 2 weeks ago, the Prime Minister was talking about everything back to normal by Christmas. And then yesterday, he's talking about the fact that this is going to be here for a long time, and now sacrifices
and it's all Europe's fault. The second wave is coming from Europe, which is just the narratives around this are extraordinary. The only good thing is that I don't actually know anybody who believes it anymore.
No,
but it's interesting. Although I did also read this morning that James Murdoch has left Fox News, the entire empire, because of differences in the narrative. And as I understand it, of all the Murdoch science, he's the one who gets climate change. And if he were to set up a competing news network, that might be very interesting. So I'm really interested in the neuroscience. And I know that you worked with a radiologist or a neuroscientist who's looked at neuroplasticity. And I would really like to talk about that, because it seems to me that I'm aware, even as we're speaking, that I get back into my tribal judgmentalism. And having spent all of last week talking to the lovely Benjamin Ross about how not to be tribal, I'm still not getting it. But there must be ways whereby we can maximize the ways of increasing our neuroplasticity, of enhancing our ability to change and of imagining generative futures. Can you speak to that at all?
Yeah, sure. I mean, one of the myths that certainly I was guilty of believing is that your brain stops developing when you sort of hit your 30s, early 40s, and that's most definitely not the case. Your brain continues, your hippocampus continues to manufacture neurons until the day you die. The rate of production decreases as you age, but you're continually making new cells. There's also an increase in the rate of neural death if those cells aren't used for functional purposes within 72 hours of their creation. So you have to keep using your brain. Yeah, you have to keep using your brain. It's like a muscle. You have to keep using it, and that will increase the rate of manufacture, and that will, and the more you use it, the more you'll keep of the neurons that are manufactured. So yes, your rate of new neuron production declines. It slows as you age, but as long as you keep using your brain, you will be able to form new cells. Your brain shrinks. It starts shrinking in mass, roughly at a rate of about 1% per year from the age of 40. So your brain is actually getting smaller, but that doesn't necessarily impede performance, provided you keep using it. And whenever I was lucky enough to spend a week out at the Weizmann Institute in Tel Aviv 3 years ago, and some of the stuff they're doing there, studying neuroscience and longevity, is absolutely fascinating. And they found a direct link between two things: social interaction and brain activity. So how much you're using your brain and the type of activity you're using it for, and longevity. You will live longer if you are part of a community and you are using your brain for challenging cognitive function.
Right.
So
and what defines challenging cognitive function?
So what seems to create the most benefit in terms of increasing neuroplasticity and increasing neuron production is spatial challenges, spatial problems. So there have been studies done comparing, say, crosswords with Sudoku, and Sudoku outperforms crosswords in terms of stimulating activity. The other thing that's really interesting is a good friend of mine is professor of cognitive neuroscience at Oxford, Dr. Mark Woolridge, and he's done studies looking at the benefits of exercise for improvement in cognitive function in people who haven't got any neurological conditions and people who have. And exercise seems to be a benefit across the board. But what's interesting is it doesn't matter what kind of exercise. And it can be walking, it can be running. And his theory, and this hasn't been tested, his theory is that it's actually not so much the exercise, which does improve blood flow and oxygenation and everything.
Oh, it's the balance, is it?
Well, no, he actually thinks it's it's nature. He thinks that it's being outdoors and the outdoor stimulus of seeing so many things, your brain taking in so much data, which brings me on to the thing that I think we talked about off air was phytoncides.
Yes, please, yes.
So we're kind of riffing now, which is moving from neural production, neuroplasticity, to immune system enhancement. So there are these chemicals given off by trees called phytoncides. And there have been numerous studies. I mean, it started really, I think, in Japan.
Yeah, with the forest bathing.
Yeah, with the forest bathing. And there have been numerous studies showing an improved immune response from exposure to phytoncides. So both in nature, but also, I mentioned the study where they had taken the chemicals from the tree and just put it into a hotel room and saw if that gave any improvement, and it did. Then there's the study.
These are the chemicals given off by the trees.
They're given off by trees. They're given off by trees, and they're proven to give an immune enhancement to human beings. So those two things taken together the idea that exercise in nature is beneficial to your brain, and being exposed to the chemicals given off by trees is beneficial to your immune system, kind of point to the fact that we were evolved to benefit from being in our environment. Right, exactly.
Yes.
Being in our natural environment. So if I was, we're talking about how to institute change and how to implement beneficial change. One of the things that I think we need to do is, the old system, the system that's in charge at the moment, is very resistant to change. It'll do everything it can. We're seeing it, as I said, with the pandemic. It would rather people died so we can go to the shops.
Yes, so that an economic system that doesn't work anyway can be perpetuated.
Right.
Because we don't have a model for an alternative economic system that might give them a sense of a get-out-of-jail-free card.
Right. But what we can do is we can use that economic system, we can use that political system, we can use that social system to further a different agenda. And so we were talking about how can we affect change? How can we encourage people into new ways of thinking and new ways of doing? And one of the ways is self-interest. And so if you want more trees because it's going to benefit the planet, the easiest way to convince people to plant more trees is to convince them that it's going to benefit themselves, which it does.
Yes.
And so, but it's difficult in an economic system that is predicated on the idea that everyone has to make money at every step of the way to get airtime for something as simple as being around trees improves your cognitive performance, and we can talk about this as well. It improves your longevity, it improves your immune system, your immune response, and it improves your mental health as well. So there are a multitude of studies that show that exposure to nature is beneficial in terms of fighting depression. There have been, I think it's the same Japanese team that did studies about hospital recovery, and people who could see trees from their hospital rooms recovered quicker than people who couldn't. Yeah.
So, and therefore we need to look at the airflows and see, was it the phytoncides or was it simply being able to see trees?
Was it simply being able to see them, right?
Yes. And so then blind people also who are in rooms that have access to trees recover the same speed.
I love the scientist's mind immediately figuring out what controls you need, and I love it.
Yeah.
So, but then there was the other study we talked about, which was the Harvard School of Public Health, which looked at they surveyed 100,000 women across America and found that incidents of depression, heart disease, anxiety were all lower in people who lived near or in green areas. So it's quite significant, but there's no money to be made from it. So, we have to get the message out in other ways. And once people kind of cotton on to the fact that it is in their interests to have more nature around them, we might just have a hope of, stopping
them building HS2, which is taking down ancient woodland, for instance.
I don't think there's any chance of stopping that now. But
really?
Yes, you're right. Yeah, no, I don't think so. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so
that's a whole separate rabbit hole. Let's not go there because quite a lot of our listeners are not in the UK and won't even know what that is. It's something that needs to stop. So we're heading towards the hour, and there's so much stuff that I would really like to still look at. But it seems this is where we've been heading. So we convince people that it's in their personal interest to plant trees, and it's in their personal interest to have strong and powerful social systems. And it seems to me that one of the things that lockdown taught us was a renewed sense of community. And in this kind of strange, not quite post-lockdown period that we're in now, it seems to me that the community spirit sense is still there up to a point. I think one of the reasons I think that the world governments who were so desperate to get back to before lockdown is that they didn't want there to be a new normal, that there is probably enough neuroscience done of how long a state obtains before it becomes the normal. And they didn't want the new normal to be a sense of community spirit and a sense of people actually doing with their days something that felt generative rather than pointless, and that consumerism needed to kick off again. If we were able to construct a world in which economic growth were not the only indicator of success, and social structure, social benefit, and generative ways of living were the norm, then it seems to me that would be a step on the way to mitigating the chaos of climate change. With your contacts, because you clearly have some extraordinary good contacts in the system as it exists, are you seeing any signs at all that the powers that be are looking towards this, or are they all moving back towards what was?
I'm laughing because I wish. Yeah.
Okay, so can you write another paper for free market conservatives that would change them? Because I can't believe, these are decent people. Much as I loathe some of them, they're not there deliberately being evil, I don't think. They are doing what they believe is right. How do we help them to see that there are other ways?
I think, well, I mean, part of it is this lack of imagination that we've already talked about. Part of it is not being able to picture what an alternative looks like. The system always has been like this, and it always will be. It's kind of the way that they perceive it, even though the system has never always been the way it is. It's always been changing. We've evolved through many different systems, and actually, I think it's almost easier to change things than it is to try and teach people how things can be changed, if that makes sense. I think it's better to lead by example
Yes.
and to change things than it is to try and convince people, because you're fighting against so much, and there's fear. What is this alternative going to look like? What does it mean for me? There's the lack of imagination, which is kind of tied to the fear. I can't picture this. I can't see how I fit into it. And there's also comfort. There's comfort and ease. Why should I change things? It's working for me.
Yes.
But it's not working for billions of other people, but it's working for me. So, that I had hoped, when you encounter something as profound as this pandemic, I'd hoped that it would be an inflection point, a point for reflection, that there would be profound change. And what's interesting is when you talk to people individually, a lot of people are saying, I am going to make a conscious effort not to go back to the way things were. I was spending a lot of time and energy achieving nothing. I was stressing about things that weren't important. I was worrying about things that didn't matter. I wasn't devoting enough time to the things that do matter. I had my life out of balance. And it's a common conversation that I'm having across the board because people have had time to pause and to reflect. I'm not seeing any evidence of that reflection in the corridors of power, if you like, but I believe that we're going to be forced there anyway, because the simple fact of the matter is, in America, they're talking about 40 million people being evicted over the course of this year.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
You're talking about mass unemployment. You've seen a 33% fall in GDP.
Yes.
There's
When the
to
Great
have to
Depression
be
was 11.
right.
It's three times as bad as the Great Depression.
Right. So you're going to have a situation where you either well, there is no either. The system as it exists cannot continue with that kind of level of hardship because that loss will percolate up and it will touch the people at the very top, whether they like it or not. Because even someone like Jeff Bezos, people are not going to have money to spend at Amazon. They're not going to have money. If you just let this ripple through,
I think when you're a trillionaire, that might cease to matter.
But it does. But it does, because what happens then? You get social disorder, you get crime.
Yes.
Eventually it touches people everywhere. Through.
Yes.
So ultimately, I think we're going to be forced into examining what our system looks like. You may end up in a situation where it is essential to have a universal basic income, something that I know a lot of people have been lobbying for a while. But actually, it comes about because of a crisis. We've already seen a massive reduction in greenhouse gases because of a fall in air travel, of transportation use, of all of the cruise ships and all of the things that have stopped now. And we're actually going to be able to measure what this does to to the environment. We've already seen, that the oceans are cleaner, and, very visible illustrations of the impact that we've been having on the planet. And so we're being given an opportunity to now, I think, to re-engineer things. Well, we're also being forced into it. So I actually am, in a way, this is going to be a very difficult time in human history, but I'm optimistic about where this is going to take us. And I'm also optimistic that despite the resistance that we're going to face, change will be forced upon us. And so the things that people have been resisting in terms of the structural changes to society, I think they're going to be forced to accept.
Okay. It's such a shame we got to the hour. I would love to talk to you about UBI. It's one of my... I really would have loved to go down that rabbit hole. I don't think we have time. I think that might be podcast number 2. Because it seems to me that when things begin to crumble, the ideas that are picked up are the ideas that are lying around. And UBI is definitely one of those. UBS, Universal Basic Services, is another. Each of these still is predicated on the economic system as it stands. I think what I would like to see is that we have some very much more imaginative economic proposals worked out in a way that those who can make them happen can get their heads around them, which is quite a big ask, but we can look at that in the next podcast. As a closing thing, if we are heading here, if the old structure is crumbling, if it is the case that people individually do not want to go back to how the way things were, what can people listening do in their own lives, do you think, to help move us towards a generative future? What can we leave people with a kind of action points to do?
Okay, well, I think action points to do. The first thing is it is in all of our interests to spend time in and around nature.
Yay.
It's a really simple thing to do, right? Really simple. It doesn't cost you anything, and it's really easy to do. It's going to improve your mental health, your cognitive performance, your physical health, but it's also going to give you time to reflect. If you go for a walk, it's not formal meditation, but it will give you time to reflect. And often I have my best ideas when I'm out either for a run or for a walk. And so giving yourself that space and time, whether it is through meditation or whether it's through exercise, whether it's through, going for a walk or whatever, to reflect is absolutely crucial, because that's where you get imagination. That's where you get rid of the fear and you get imagination from. And then the other thing that I think is connecting with people who are trying to make a difference, trying to bring about change. So reaching out to networks like yours, and there are many of these communities springing up that are focused on trying to improve things. So reach out to those, and then look at where you can make small practical differences in your own life and where you can help others. So it might be something as simple as planting a tree. It might be something much more complicated, like developing a genetically engineered cure to coronavirus,
as Adam is doing.
Which I'm helping those who are doing it. Yeah.
Yes.
So there's a whole spectrum of activities that people can engage in, but I think it all starts with that moment of time and reflection.
Yeah. Thank you. That's a very, very good place to end. So people listening, moments of time and connection, get out into the natural world. And from an accidental God's point of view, certainly from my point of view, that's also the time where you can open your heart space and listen to the rest of the more than human world, because I think there's quite a lot of answers to be had there. But that's my springbox, not yours. So Adam Hamdy, thank you so very much for the depth and the extraordinary breadth of your wisdom. And we've covered so many things on this podcast, and there's so much still to do. So I'd really like to hope that we can come back for a second time at some point, perhaps later in wherever this coronavirus goes, by which time you might have launched a cure, which would be very interesting. So thank you. That's it for episode 1 with Adam Hamdy.
Thank you very much for having me, Amanda. It's been a really lovely experience.
So that's it for another week. with enormous thanks to Adam for the breadth and the depth and the perspicacity of his insight into so many things. I genuinely hope we can do another, possibly even more neurogeeky interview with Adam at a future date. In the meantime, I will put links in the show notes to his website, to the paper on the Conservative Free Market site. That is the first, possibly the last time I have ever read that particular blog, but his paper is really well worth reading. I will link to his books, I will link to the review from Peter Forshaw, and to Ligandal, the company of which he is on the board. We will be back next week with another conversation exploring different futures that we can choose to make if we set our intent in their direction. In the meantime, thanks as ever to Caro C. for the sound production and for the music at the head and foot of the podcast. Thanks to Faith Tilleray for being the other half of the creative team that is Accidental Gods, and for designing the website. If you want to come and visit us, our address is accidentalgods.life. You can email us from there if you want to give us comments about the podcast, if you want to suggest future people for us to interview, or if you want to find the show notes, or other podcasts, or the visualizations and meditations that are in the resources section, or more information about the Accidental Gods membership portal, which is a structured program designed to give anybody the ways that we need to connect to the more than human world in the ways that Adam was describing, and to go deeper so that we can begin to ask the questions that we need to ask of the greater web of consciousness in ways that allow us to hear answers that are authentic and grounded and useful. So if you know of anybody else who would like to be active in co-creating the more beautiful world that our hearts know is possible, then please do send them this link. And that's it for now. See you next week. Thank you, and goodbye.